OK, there we go. That was Donald Trump. And I think he has finished taking questions now. Let's go straight to our Middle East correspondent, Adam Parsons, in Jerusalem. We heard a lot there from Donald Trump on a whole range of subjects. Of course, the context is a ceasefire that's been agreed between Lebanon and Israel. But he was talking a lot about Iran, too. He said we're close to a deal. What did you make of what we heard?
Yeah, I mean, this was classic Donald Trump, wasn't it? Sort of riffing as he went along, exuding that kind of optimism that he uses so often to drive policy decisions. Clearly thinking that a deal with Iran is possible. I think you heard him there saying that if there was a deal, he might be on his way out to Islamabad. I think you could almost hear the American embassy in Islamabad thinking, right, how are we going to plan for that? He also was talking about Israel and Lebanon's leaders coming to the White House. I think, Ali, at the start of that, he said it would be a week or a week and a half. By the time he got nearer the end of the line, he was saying it would be 4 to 5 days before they came out there. I mean, he doesn't get into the details of it, does he? He talks about, when he was asked, a very good question, which was, well, it's not just about Israel and Lebanon, it's about Hezbollah as well. And he simply said, well, Lebanon will deal with Hezbollah. Well, unfortunately, Lebanon and Hezbollah have been dealing with each other for many, many, many years without coming up with a sustained peace deal. And I suppose if you take a step away, that is still the challenge that you would put to the White House, which is, firstly, when he takes the credit for stopping wars, I think by common consent this was a war that he himself started. So by coming up with ceasefires, you are effectively just going back to largely the position you were in previously. Now, the president is talking there about having degraded all of Iran's military might, of having said he took away their leaders. His critics would say, well, the leaders have been replaced by similar sort of characteristics, and that Iran is still a formidable foe which has exploited its power in the Strait of Hormuz. So I think when you unpick all of this, you still get the fact that clearly what Donald Trump has done is set a framework where negotiations are going to happen. And I think what we're looking at today is this potential that a variety of chronic issues here in the Middle East could end up being lumped together. And in that place, we don't really know how that would end. So the Israelis are adamant that one of the reasons that they've agreed reluctantly to a ceasefire in Lebanon is that they want the future of Hezbollah, spoiler alert, they want it to be dismantled. They want the future of Hezbollah put in these negotiations with Iran. They want Iran to stop funding Hezbollah and Hamas and the Houthis in Yemen. So they want that right there, the heart. Now, the Americans are very focused on nuclear enrichment, and I guess now about the Strait of Hormuz. The Iranians will want movement on sanctions and integration back into the world. But if all of those things are on the table, and if a future peace deal, however optimistic that might sound, involving Hezbollah, Israel and Lebanon, is also part of a grand discussion. Hard to imagine this is going to be done in one session in Islamabad. I think there are European officials today briefing that this could take the rest of the year, certainly sort of 6 months to thrash out. But we could potentially be in the sort of diplomatic framework that we haven't seen before. And for that, at least, I guess the president is hoping to get some credit. In terms of the ceasefire itself, by the way, what is it? It's 9:25 local time here now. The ceasefire will begin in 2.5 hours. Some headlines of that, we're expecting a further statement from Benjamin Netanyahu. Clearly, he was reluctant to sign up to this. Clearly, he was corralled by Donald Trump. Hezbollah are telling people not to return to towns in the south of Lebanon. They are talking about retaining the right to resist as long as Israeli forces are there, and the IDF will keep forces in the south of Lebanon to try and maintain that buffer zone. But sources around this region are telling me that they are quietly confident that this ceasefire will hold. Why? Well, because the Americans want it to work and the Iranians want it to work. And ultimately their expectation is that Hezbollah will do what they're told, and probably so will Israel.
Adam, thank you very much for us live there in Jerusalem. Well, as Adam just mentioned, the ceasefire is scheduled to begin tonight at 10 o'clock, just as we're getting underway with our late night programme, The Wrap. Here to discuss it all, the day's big stories will be the journalist and author Christina Patterson and the Times radio presenter Rod Liddle. Well, let's move on to our top political story this evening. As you can see, we're joined by Beth Rigby, our political editor, and Sam Coates, our deputy political editor, because Sir Keir Starmer is facing fresh calls to resign and accusations of misleading Parliament over the vetting process for the appointment of Lord Mandelson as US ambassador. There's so much to get through. We'll come to you in a moment, Sam. But Beth, first, just explain this, because we understand that he failed the vetting process, and you've been speaking to people in Number 10.
Yeah, look, this is a massive story for the Prime Minister, and there is fury in Number 10 tonight. They are insisting that the Prime Minister was not given the full facts over Mandelson's vetting. And I would say the depth of the fury that I'm picking up when I'm talking to people inside the operation is matched only by the seriousness of the situation that they know the Prime Minister is in. And if we just step back a bit, what appears to have happened is that the Prime Minister has been going to the Commons. Indeed, he told me at a press conference on March the 16th that due process had been followed with the appointment of Lord Mandelson, that he had been vetted in the normal way. He told me at a press conference, he said at other press events, but most importantly, he told MPs this in the House of Commons. And what's emerged, and it came through a story in The Guardian, but as I understand it, the government were alerted to this earlier in the week and have been trying to establish the facts, that Lord Mandelson was granted security clearance against the recommendation of your UK security vetting. So that suggests that the Prime Minister was given or not given this information. That's what he's saying. But the consequence of that is, did he mislead the House of Commons? Now, that is a very, very serious charge indeed. If you have knowingly misled the House of Commons, where you saw the mess Boris Johnson got into that over whether or not he'd misled the Commons over Partygate. Now, sort of what's going on tonight is that there is a fierce pushback by Number 10. They are telling people that the Prime Minister, that his advisers were not made aware of what had happened over this vetting process, that it was a process within the Foreign Office, that information was not shared. And I'm told that the Prime Minister had been asking questions about vetting for months and had not been given this information while giving statements to Parliament. So now there's this scramble to establish the facts. As I understand it, the Prime Minister will go to the Commons on Monday. He will give a statement and he will correct the record. And the big heavy word in all of this was whether he knowingly misled the House. So it has to be proven that he knowingly misled MPs over the vetting process. And what Number 10 are clearly saying is there have been massive errors made, but the Prime Minister and his advisers were unaware, and that will be the defence that he gives. But he will have to go to the Commons to correct the record, and I expect to see that happen on Monday. But he is in a lot of hot water over this. There are calls from opposition leaders, Kemi Badenoch and the like, saying tonight that the Prime Minister has to resign over this. So he is in a very, very difficult predicament indeed. For months he's been saying one thing, and it turns out that that was not the truth and that was not correct.
OK, thank you, Beth. You mentioned reaction there. Well, let's get some reaction now.
If he has misled Parliament, as it looks like he has, he should resign. If he has broken the ministerial code, as it looks like he has, he should resign. If he withheld documents from, via cover-up from Parliament, he should resign.
He was relying on the vetting process as his defence. It looks like the vetting process was ignored. This is hugely serious, and I think he will probably have to go.
It must be the case that the Prime Minister had been told he failed vetting. He lied to the British people, he lied to Parliament, he must resign.
OK, lots of reaction there. Sam, Why do we think the Prime Minister didn't take more of a role in such a serious issue?
I mean, it's a very good question, and that is a question that I think will be unpicked over the coming days. How did this end up how do you end up getting this all so wrong? So essentially what has happened is that the government has come out today and said that Peter Mandelson, Lord Mandelson, did not pass develop vetting. So the big problem that he faces is that contradicts something the Prime Minister said on camera on February the 5th. So today they said he failed direct vetting. Look at this.
If he has misled Parliament, as it looks like he has, he should resign. If he has broken the ministerial code...
Mr Speaker, as she and the House would expect, full due process was followed during this appointment, as it is with all ambassadors. Mr Speaker, as I say, full due process was gone through in relation to this appointment. As would be expected, a full due process was gone through when the appointment was made.
I think that's not quite the clip you expected, Sam, but explain.
What we were trying to show was that today the government admitted that the vetting failed, but on February the 5th, Keir Starmer said on camera to the public, to Sky News viewers, that Peter Mandelson passed the vetting. So there is a prima facie, a big problem there. The Prime Minister... The claim of the Prime Minister in Downing Street this evening is that he wasn't told about any of this, that he was asking questions but didn't know. But what the clip that we'd hoped to show you demonstrates is that he was proactively offering a view about vetting that is wrong. Was he freelancing or had he been misled? And it's the gap between asking questions and not getting the answer and actually sort of filling a space where he didn't have the facts with a version of events that has now turned out to be true. I think that's one area in which the Prime Minister faces quite a lot of questions in the coming hours. Now, opposition leaders are hanging a lot on this question about whether he misled the Commons. It appears to me that the Prime Minister in the Commons was more cautious at the dispatch box than he was on TV. At the dispatch box, all he would say is due process was followed. Now, I think in the broadest, most civil servant, yes, minister way, you could just about claim that there was a process, it was followed, and that Whitehall officials are allowed to overturn the UK security authorities' recommendation. There is provision for that, rare as it is. I think the bigger charge is a simply political one. All the way along, everybody knew that Peter Mandelson was a deeply controversial figure, but they nevertheless rammed it through. Keir Starmer didn't phone or speak to Peter Mandelson ahead of his appointment, and the charge essentially is that there was a hear no evil, see no evil approach to this appointment, even though there were red flags from the security services before, and this vetting question, which, by the way, would have come up after his appointment, was glossed over at the point where he failed that direct vetting, and the government decided not to take action. Why doesn't Keir Starmer dig deeper on issues that are tricky? The really complicated issue, I think, Ali, for Keir Starmer on this is that there's a bit of a theme about that, on exactly that issue, throughout lots of issues of his premiership. Why doesn't he run into the difficult stuff before doing it? And that's why I think this has resonance tonight. OK,
Sam, thank you. Let's bring in Emily Thornberry, who joins us, the chair of the Foreign Affairs Select Committee and Labour MP. Hi, Emily. Can we get your reaction to the story?
Well, so I particularly wanted to make the point that the Foreign Affairs Committee is responsible for holding the Foreign Office to account, to try to make sure we have proper scrutiny. And we asked for Peter Mandelson to come before the committee before he went to Washington so we could ask him a series of questions. And if only we had been allowed to ask him those questions, we would have asked a series of questions and maybe he would have lied or maybe he wouldn't, but it would have been on record. And then when we got all of this, you know, when he had to resign and all the stuff came out, then I wanted to have people in front of us. I wanted them to ask questions. So I got Ollie Robbins, who's the person in charge of the Foreign Office, and I got the guy who was in charge of all the civil service, who's recently changed, right, the one from number 10. So the two top civil servants came in front of us, and we asked absolutely direct questions. Were there red flags from the security services? What did they say? What was the response? And I also have it in writing, because we wrote, and there's a letter of the 16th of September, and I have to say, I begin to have some sympathy for the Prime Minister, because when you're told that there's due process, you think that it means something. I'm told, for example, in this, Peter Mandelson's security vetting was conducted to the usual standards set for developed vetting in line with established Cabinet Office policy. It doesn't say, so it says he was vetted, And he says he was appointed, but it doesn't say it was overridden.
So you don't think he's misled Parliament?
Well, what I'm saying is that, you know, people have basically been telling us half the story. People have been taking the mickey. You know, it is a bit like, you know, you ask somebody, how did you get to work today? And they say, oh, I ran to work. They miss out the bit about being chased by a bear.
So what's gone wrong here, then?
So what's happened is that we have been mandarined. You know, we are not being told the full story. And, I mean, we're a hot committee. We ask the right questions, but we're not getting the right answers. And as I say, I have this here. Now, the question is then, is that if the vetting was overridden, who overrode it? Who decided he's failed his vetting, nevertheless he's going to be appointed? And really the question is, was it Ollie Robbins, who was like a senior civil servant who has only been in the post for a couple of weeks, you know, and who's going to say, well, this political appointment, they failed their security vetting. I am going to decide all by myself that I'm going to override this and have him appointed anyway. Or was he being pushed by someone else? And there is some, you know, there are others apart from the Prime Minister. And we do know that the head of his office resigned because, you know, and took all responsibility for what had happened. I mean, and Number 10's denial just talks about politicians. It doesn't talk about...
I mean, they have, sorry to interrupt, they have said tonight, they've clearly said that as far as they know, none of the advisers knew either. I mean, one of Conservative advisers we've been on has texted, and I want to put this to you. They say, Downing Street seriously asking us to believe Ollie Robbins, the most proper of proper civil servants, decided not to tell Number 10 or any minister Mandelson had failed the vetting until this week. They say it beggars belief, and Starmer's trying it as an excuse. But you seem to have a bit of sympathy with the PM on this.
Well, I have sympathy with the PM in terms of, you know, people use such weasel words. And I'm a lawyer, and I would have thought that I would be able to suss this out. But I didn't realise that when they write to you and say, we concluded DV clearance, you know, in advance of Lord Mandelson taking up the post in February, that they had missed a bit out.
So you don't think the Prime Minister should have had more of a kind of grip on such an important...
I'm not saying one way or the other in relation to that. What I'm saying is that if tonight what we're trying to work out is how on earth did this happen, I think that it must go further than Ollie Robbins. And then the question is who. And we have had somebody resign and take full responsibility. He was very close to Peter Mandelson. You know, I don't think by himself Ollie Robbins is... But, I mean, listen, we've asked Ollie Robbins to come in front of the committee again and explain next week. And perhaps he can tell us, you know, sort of, was it his own idea, or was he being lent on elsewhere, or was he being a civil servant? Was he getting direction from elsewhere? And if so, by whom?
OK. Let's get a brief final thought or question from Sam.
It's a little question. I think there's a little wrinkle in all of this. I was under the impression that at the point that Peter Mandelson took up the job, the vetting process hadn't been completed and somebody had issued a waiver to effectively allow him to enter that job while vetting was going on, and it would be completed while he was in post. That's the rather curious circumstance.
No, it's slightly different. It's slightly different. What they did was that they did one part of it. So they did the bit which is the propriety and ethics.
Yeah.
You know, first bit, the Cabinet Office does that bit. They then announced that he had been appointed, and then they did the vetting. And once it's been announced, it's quite difficult to walk it back.
So forgive me. I think we're saying broadly the same.
Well, he didn't start the job until later, but
But I think he started the job at a point where the vetting was still going on. So the question for Ollie Robbins, when he received the information that Peter Mandelson had failed to develop vetting tests, you had an ambassador in post, and it was up to him whether or not to oust him. And
we're really getting into the weeds, but basically, I think it was the end of January that the overriding happened, and he didn't start the job until later.
Do you think this is going to?
But there had been the announcement, and imagine the embarrassment. You've made a decision to have a political appointment, right? You've announced it, and then you go, oh, actually, they failed the security vetting. I mean, what would that say about our country?
We need to move on. But lastly, Emily, I mean, we've had so much of this. Do you think this could sink the Prime Minister?
No, I don't think so, because I do think that genuinely, I think that when he was in front of Parliament, he had a script in front of him and he was reading out what he had been told, which anybody would think meant, as I did myself, he's passed his vetting. And then when he's in Hastings and he's being asked and he's just answering, he's going, well, he passed his security vetting. Because on the basis of what he's been told, he's presumed. I mean, whether the Prime Minister should be on top of everything, should he be superhuman, should he be able to cover everything, or should he rely on others that give him advice? I mean, look, he's only a human being.
OK, thank you so much, Emily, Beth and Sam. Now, as we've been discussing, we don't need to tell you that the Epstein scandal has loomed large over British public life in the last year. And we do talk a lot about the men associated with Jeffrey Epstein. Peter Mandelson, the man that we've just been talking about, sacked as US ambassador. Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor, the former prince, stripped of his titles. Both men are now facing police investigation. Both men vehemently deny any wrongdoing. The people we don't hear from enough, though, are the survivors. The women like Lisa Phillips. This was Lisa Phillips in her early 20s before everything changed. This was her on her way to Jeffrey Epstein's private island. Well, today she is in Westminster with a direct appeal to the Prime Minister and the King for a full public inquiry into a child trafficking network here in the UK. We spent the day with her, watched her go into Parliament to meet with crossbench MPs. We'll play you our full interview in a moment. But first, we wanted to give you a bit of a sense of the mood from Lisa and some of those MPs who are backing her in Westminster today.
I'm here to ask the King and the Prime Minister for a public inquiry in the UK for the global survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell. I mean, I used to live in England as a child, so I don't know, coming back here always feels like home a little bit. And just like Big Ben and the power that's here makes me feel really powerful.
So Lisa has been in this meeting for about an hour. We're expecting her to come out any moment now. This has obviously been a long time coming. She's come all the way from the US, and to get this cross-party group of MPs together is really significant. But the big question is, you know, are the politicians at the top of government, is the Prime Minister listening?
Hi there.
Hey Lisa, how was that?
Well, it was a very good meeting.
Yeah.
It was a good first step. So it's important for us just to lay the foundation and get the proper guidance and advice. And I think we're getting there.
There is a chance for a struggling Prime Minister here to actually deliver for women. How about do that for the Epstein victims as much as the grooming gang victims? And let's have less rhetoric, more action. It might do him some good.
It's vital that survivors are supported and enabled in coming forward. We need to see justice, we need to see accountability, we need to see criminal prosecutions where those are warranted, and we need to ensure that the state does not fail victims.
Lisa, thank you so much for talking to us. And I know you've told your story before and it can't be easy to kind of share it again and again. But I guess, first, I think it's really important for people to understand what's brought you here today. So can you just tell us a little bit about how and when you met Jeffrey Epstein?
So I met Jeffrey Epstein, I was in my early 20s, and I was a fashion model in New York City. And I had booked a big job, and I went down to the small island called Tortola. It sits next to little St. James and St. Thomas, you know, in the Caribbean.
And what happened when you got there? Did you meet him straight away?
No, I was there for a photo shoot, and then another model that was on the shoot had said, you know, I have a friend, he has an island nearby, and we had an extra day, so we just went over there just to hang out for the day for a few hours, and then we were supposed to come back. So this person sent a boat, and we went over to the island, and we just hung out there for the day.
So you went to his private island, and what was your impression of him when you first met him?
Well, I didn't meet him at first. You know, I played in the pool a little bit with some other girls that were there, and then we went for dinner, and then that's when I met him. And my first impression, he was charming and nice and polite, and he came off more like a mentor type of person. That was my initial feeling.
Did you meet any other men there?
Well, I saw a man that was in the pool. He was hanging out with the other young girls there. And then later I was introduced to him as a prince before he left the island.
And you think that was Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor?
Yeah. I didn't put the correlation to that until a couple years later when a girlfriend of mine had mentioned that she had an encounter with a prince. And that's when she showed me like the pictures and stuff. I was like, oh, that's the guy that I met originally on the island.
And we obviously have to say that Andrew Mountbatten-Windsor denies any wrongdoing. But what happened later? Things took a turn, right?
Well, yeah, back on the island, later on that evening, I guess it got too late for us to go home, and now I had met Jeffrey Epstein, and he had said, oh, you're not going home, you're going to stay here for the night. And so later on that evening, we were told to do a massage, and the massage turned into a sexual assault.
And that brings you here to Westminster, all these years on. You're speaking to politicians. I mean, I guess I firstly kind of want to ask, what do you think you and that girl in your early 20s would have thought now if you'd known you were still fighting now for that girl?
Oh, I would never would have thought that I would be here today. I was never even planning on speaking out. I think it just, one thing happens after the other. Not seeing justice really happen in 2008. And then a group of survivors coming together in 2019 and speaking out. And that's how really it came about, was to support other survivors' stories. And it was a couple years later when I started telling my story of what happened to me. It took a lot of courage to get there to that point, after being deposed for other cases and going through the settlement funds and finding out there was hundreds of other girls. And as a podcast host, I had spoken to many, many of them that were victims of Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell.
Yeah, and we obviously really appreciate you speaking to us this evening. Tell us a bit about why you have come to Westminster and what you're hoping to achieve.
Well, my survivor sisters and I at Capitol Hill, we've been fighting for the Transparency Act and to have accountability and awareness of what's going on. And maybe a little bit more than half of the files have been released, and we don't have a full understanding of what's going on. But what I've learned is there's a lot of UK survivors. And I just feel like it was the right thing to do with our powerful quests that we had at Capitol Hill in the United States, to find out and support survivors of Ghislaine Maxwell and Jeffrey Epstein in the UK. And so I came here today with some allies, Ivana Bocik from Ireland, who's been a big supporter of myself and the survivors, and my team at SPY, the Sexual Predator Accountability Institute. Our team met with some MPs today, and we had a really good meeting. It was productive, and they were helping to give advice and guidance of what our next steps should be here in the UK to push a public inquiry. And that was initially my stance today, was to call to the King and the Prime Minister, about if they're going to support a public inquiry.
Do you think the Prime Minister's listening to you?
Well, I learned today in the meeting that he has the power to have a public inquiry like that, if he wanted to do so. But I also learned that it's a long process, and the advice that the MPs gave me, that gave us, was to reach out to survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, to talk to the victims that are out there. We know that between 4 and 10 have come forward at this time, or actually in the last 10 years, and went to the Metropolitan Police and their own local police stations, and they advised that these survivors should go to their local police. Yeah. But I just think that they've already done that, and they weren't successful. Nothing's come about, that process. And so what I would like to say today is, for survivors of Jeffrey Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell, or anyone in their orbit, that should feel comfortable and feel safe and protected with myself and my team, to reach out to thespy.org. That's thespy.org, and fill out the form, and we'll be in contact with them.
So this is about people feeling able to come forward. Would you like to meet with the Prime Minister?
Absolutely, yes. I think myself and survivors, we have a lot of U.S. survivors that can support this, but what we really need to speak to the Prime Minister is UK survivors. We're talking about the criminal activity that happened in the UK, whether it happened here or they were trafficked out of here. It's really important to have British survivors.
The Prime Minister's apologised before, in particular around the appointment of Peter Mandelson. What did you think of his apology as a survivor?
Well, he did apologise, and we thank him for that apology. But we need to take it one step further, and there needs to be an awareness and accountability. And I think the British people really deserve, just like the American people deserve, and that we fought for so much over the last 9 months. I think that something similar needs to happen in the UK, and I think the UK is more empathetic to survivors of sexual assault, and I feel like the people really want to see justice with Epstein, with the Epstein case.
So it sounds like, today is a step, but there is still so much more that needs to be done in this country.
Well, there's a lot more, yeah, and the awareness of, what's going on. And I know in your country you've had issues like this in the past, and you've been very successful at holding, people accountable. And I think when it comes to Jeffrey Epstein and his global sex trafficking ring, and Ghislaine Maxwell's been held accountable in the United States, but what about when her term is up? She hasn't been held accountable in the UK. And so that's really important to survivors. They've always told me for the last couple of years that Ghislaine Maxwell is the most important to them because they feel like she was the ringleader of all of it.
Are there any politicians you feel have really listened to you?
MP Edward Davey has been phenomenal with speaking out in support of Epstein survivors. He actually is the only one that I know of that's spoken out on Parliament.
And would you like that from the Prime Minister?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's what
you're fighting for, right?
I think that's what we're fighting for, yes.
I also want to ask you about the King's visit to the US. He's not going to be meeting with survivors. What did you make of that decision?
Those are my survivor sisters that were calling for that meeting with the King. I just decided to come straight over here and speak to the MPs about that and maybe go about it in a different way, because my heart is always here with, in the UK. I spent, since I was 2 months old here, my first 5 years of life here, and it always feels like I'm coming home. I grew up half my life in Europe, and so for me, I am very well aware of the European girls and Eastern European girls that were trafficked from here to the United States and abroad. So I still always want to stand up for survivors, and I'm always speaking to them when I talk.
If the King did meet with survivors, what do you think their message would be, and what would your message be?
Support. I think they should support survivors, no matter what that means, whether it's a public inquiry or helping to bring whoever needs to be brought to justice, that they support that.
And lastly, if you had a direct message right now for the Prime Minister and the King, what would it be?
I would say to support a public inquiry. I think that's the most important thing. I know that's not a popular opinion amongst a lot of people in Parliament, but I think it's the most necessary thing to do, is to do what's right for the victims of these horrific crimes, and we do need a public inquiry to start.
Thank you so much. Lisa Phillips there, a survivor of Jeffrey Epstein, calling on the government to start a public inquiry.